The idea of creating a powerful documentary about Kuwait's prison system had been occupying the filmmaker's mind for months. She wanted to capture the reality that remained hidden behind iron bars, to reveal the voices of those who had been silenced by circumstance, society, or law. As part of her research, she had already visited several smaller facilities where prisoners usually shared fragments of their stories, some with pride in their resilience, others with shame or regret. But the day she stepped into Kuwait's Central Women's Prison, she realized that this visit would not resemble anything she had experienced before. From the moment she entered the heavy gates, there was a strange stillness in the air. The corridors echoed only with the sound of footsteps and the metallic clang of doors closing, yet the prisoners themselves remained unnaturally silent. Expecting hesitant but eventual cooperation, she approached the women with gentle questions. What crime had brought them here? How long had they been imprisoned? Did they have families waiting outside? But every question fell into a void. Some women turned their faces away, others looked down at the floor, and a few shifted as if they had not even heard her. It was as though an unspoken rule of silence had been imposed upon them all. What disturbed her even more were the marks etched on their bodies. Faded bruises, scars along their arms, burns on their wrists, signs of pain that could not be explained by years of confinement alone. These women had been imprisoned for long periods, some for several years, yet the fresh wounds told another story, one that no one dared to speak of. The filmmaker's curiosity deepened into unease. She had seen prisoners in other countries resist speaking out of fear, but never had she encountered such a collective refusal, such an atmosphere of dread that bound everyone into silence. Hours slipped by in frustration. She moved from one ward to another, waiting for a crack in the wall of fear, but found none. The silence felt heavier than chains. She wondered how she could ever complete her project if no one was willing to open their heart. For a moment, she considered turning instead to the warden, hoping that the authority figure might provide background details. But just when despair was about to weigh her down completely, something unexpected happened. Across the yard, a woman with sharp Arab features caught her eye. Unlike the others, she did not turn away. With a slight tilt of her head, she beckoned the filmmaker closer, her expression carrying both caution and urgency. Her name, she would later learn, was Baziga, and in that moment, the silence that had suffocated the prison began to fracture, opening the door to a story darker and more unsettling than the filmmaker could have ever imagined. Baziga's voice was steady at first, though her eyes betrayed the weight of memories that had scarred her soul. She began by telling how ordinary her life once seemed, how simple her days used to be before everything turned into a nightmare. She worked at a pharmaceutical factory near the port of Kuwait, a respectable job that provided her with stability after a life marked by abandonment. Her husband had long since left her, and her family had shown little interest in carrying her burdens, so she had learned to rely only on herself. The factory became her routine, her lifeline, and in some ways her shield against loneliness. One evening, as she finished her shift later than usual, she carried with her two things, her own handbag and another small parcel her boss had entrusted to her. It was common practice for him to ask her to deliver items to his home on her way back, claiming they contained important medicines ordered from abroad. She never questioned him, never doubted his words, because refusing would risk her job. She remembered nodding quickly that evening, assuring him that the delivery would be safe in her hands. She managed to hail a taxi after some difficulty, the streets unusually quiet under the veil of night. The city lights shimmered in the distance as the vehicle sped toward her neighborhood. Just when she thought she would be home soon, her world collapsed in an instant. Out of nowhere, 4 vehicles swerved around the taxi, boxing it in. Brakes screeched, tires burned against the asphalt, and within seconds the taxi came to a halt. Before she could grasp what was happening, masked men flung the taxi door open, dragging her out with brutal force. A cloth was tied tightly around her eyes, plunging her into suffocating darkness. Her hands were bound, her belongings snatched from her grip. She screamed, her cries echoing into the night, but no one came. Even the taxi driver, terrified for his own life, ducked low inside his car, unwilling to intervene. Baziga struggled, begged, and shouted, but the strangers ignored her. She felt herself pushed into another vehicle, her body slammed against hard metal as the car sped away. Her thoughts raced wildly. Were these men robbers? If so, why take her as well? She had no wealth, no valuables beyond her handbag. The parcel from her boss weighed heavily on her mind. What if that was the true target? Could something inside it be so important, so dangerous that it had led to her abduction? As the car roared through the night, her heart pounded with a single dreadful certainty. Something terrible awaited her at the end of this journey. The journey felt endless. Blindfolded and bound, Baziga could not measure the distance or time, only the sharp turns of the road and the pounding of her heart. When the vehicle finally stopped, rough hands pulled her out. She was dragged down what felt like long corridors, her feet stumbling over cold concrete. At last, she was shoved into a room and the cloth was yanked from her eyes. What she saw froze her blood. It was a dim chamber, its walls painted in shadow by the single red bulb that hung overhead. The oppressive glow made the air thick and suffocating. In the center stood a table with two chairs, one already occupied by a man in uniform. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his sharp eyes followed her every move. His stare cut into her like a blade, making her spine shiver. She had always feared the police, for in Kuwait the law showed no leniency. Executions were not rare, even for those with connections to influential families. The thought that she was now alone before such an officer drained the color from her face. Summoning courage, she asked in a trembling voice why she had been brought there. The officer leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "Don't act innocent," he said coldly. "You know very well why you are here. If you admit your crime, things will be easier. Otherwise, we have other ways of making you confess." His words made her break into cold sweat. "I have done nothing wrong," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I go to work every morning and return home in the evening." "I have no crime to confess." The officer let out a cruel laugh. "You spend your days committing the gravest offense of all, and you dare pretend ignorance? Do you not realize that what you have been doing can carry the death penalty? A woman hiding under the cover of factory work, running such operations, it is shameful and unforgivable." The word death penalty echoed in her ears like a death knell. Images of the gallows flashed before her eyes. She had seen hangings on television, the way bodies convulsed in their final moments, and she had always turned away, unable to watch. The thought of herself in that position made her knees weaken. Tears blurred her vision as fear consumed her. She pleaded again, swearing she was innocent, but the officer only pressed harder. He twisted her statements into false admissions, claiming her words proved her involvement. He told her everything was recorded on paper and on camera. "You have already confessed," he said, smirking. "Now wait for your punishment." At that moment, Baziga realized she was caught in a trap from which truth alone could not free her. That night, Baziga remained trapped in the suffocating chamber. Her stomach ached with hunger, her throat burned from thirst, yet the worst torment came from the words that officer had spoken. He insisted she had confessed to crimes she knew nothing about, and the thought of execution haunted her mind like a specter. Every sound in the darkness made her flinch. Every tick of unseen minutes dragged like chains. She prayed the night would pass quickly, but the hours stretched endlessly until despair became heavier than her exhaustion. By morning, guards arrived and hauled her out. Shackled and weary, she was taken to court. The heavy doors closed behind her as she stood trembling before the judge. She finally learned the charge against her: involvement in drug trafficking under the cover of pharmaceutical work. The questions she had been asked during interrogation, twisted and recorded out of context, were now presented as evidence of her guilt. The delivery of parcels for her boss, which she had considered harmless, was portrayed as her direct participation in smuggling. She tried to speak, to explain that she had never known the contents of the packages, that she had only been following her employer's instructions out of loyalty and necessity, but her words seemed powerless. The courtroom, cold and indifferent, looked upon her not as a woman fighting for her truth, but as another criminal whose mask had finally slipped. Her pleas dissolved in the silence of the chamber, and with each passing moment, she felt her hope crumble further. The judge's verdict was swift. Without hesitation, he declared that she was guilty and sentenced her to 7 years in prison. The weight of the words crushed her spirit. 7 years. It might as well have been a lifetime. She thought of her absent husband, her indifferent family. There was no one outside these walls who would fight for her, no one to question the judgment on her behalf. She was utterly alone. As she was escorted out, her tears blurred the world around her. The clang of the prison gates closing behind her seemed to seal not only her fate but her very existence. What terrified her most was not the length of the sentence, but the knowledge that she had been condemned for something she did not do. Yet even then, she could not imagine that the punishment pronounced in court was only the beginning. For within the central prison, she would discover a reality far harsher than any official sentence could describe. A reality where suffering was not measured in years, but in nights of terror. When Baziga first entered the Central Women's Prison, she tried to prepare herself for 7 long years of isolation. In her mind, prison meant locked cells, rigid routines, and the heavy burden of loneliness. She thought she could endure it because she had already lived a solitary life outside, abandoned by her husband and overlooked by her family. At least here, she told herself bitterly, my loneliness will not be unique. Everyone is alone. But within days, she discovered how naive that assumption was. The loneliness outside had been quiet and bearable. Inside the prison, life was a kind of living death. On her third night, long after the lights were supposed to be out, a guard came to her cell and ordered her to follow. Half asleep and confused, she staggered down the corridor until she reached an interrogation room. The moment she entered, her heart seized. 4 officers sat in chairs, their expressions unreadable except for the faint, mocking smiles tugging at their lips. A single chair stood opposite them, waiting. She knew immediately it was meant for her. Her knees shook as she sat down. The men began questioning her in turns, their voices sharp, their questions deliberately laced with cruelty. At first, she tried to answer politely, repeating her innocence, but soon the conversation shifted into a realm she had never imagined. The questions became vulgar, twisted, and degrading. Each word was like a whip across her dignity. She wished the floor would open beneath her so she could disappear. Then the questions ended and something far worse began. That night, she endured hours of humiliation and abuse so horrific that she struggled to even find the words for it later. They treated her not as a human being, not even as a criminal, but as an object to break. Every passing moment stripped away another piece of her spirit. By dawn, her body was bruised, her voice hoarse from cries that no one answered. At sunrise, they dragged her back to her cell and threw her inside like discarded trash. She collapsed onto the hard floor, trembling. Another woman already in the cell glanced at her, smirked bitterly, and said, "Get used to it. This is your life now. Every night will be the same." Baziga's heart broke at the words. Tears streamed down her face as she realized her official sentence was not the real punishment. The court had given her years. The prison would give her nights of endless torment. The following day passed in a haze of pain. Baziga's body ached with every movement, her mind clouded by the memory of the previous night. She wanted to believe it had been an isolated incident, a test of her strength, perhaps even an attempt to break her spirit once and for all. But as dusk fell and the prison descended into uneasy silence, dread seeped into her veins. She lay awake, clutching her blanket, praying no one would come. Yet her prayers went unanswered. Sometime past midnight, her cell door creaked open. A guard appeared, his expression unreadable, and gestured for her to follow. Her stomach churned with fear. She hesitated, but his cold glare forced her to rise. With dragging steps, she followed him down the same endless corridors, her heart thudding louder with each turn. This time, however, she was not taken to the same interrogation room. Instead, he led her into a larger chamber filled with medical equipment. Without a word, he took her arm and plunged a syringe into her vein. The liquid burned as it entered her bloodstream, spreading a strange heat through her body. Her skin tingled, her heart raced, and her thoughts blurred into confusion. It felt as though something unnatural was coursing through her, unraveling her control over her own senses. "Tell me who you are," the officer demanded, staring into her eyes. "I am Baziga," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How long have you been working at that factory?" He pressed, his tone sharp. Her lips trembled as she answered, though she felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to explain that she had only been packaging medicines, that she had no knowledge of anything beyond her duties. But the officer's patience thinned. He gripped her hair and yanked her head back. "Enough lies. Do you think we don't know why your boss chose you? Do you think we don't know how close you were to him?" She cried out, insisting she was innocent, but her protests were drowned in his accusations. He claimed the factory was a hub for producing illegal drugs disguised as pharmaceuticals, and that her role in delivering packages to her boss's home made her an accomplice. "You carried poison into the veins of this country," he shouted. "You destroyed lives, and you dare pretend ignorance?" The words pierced her heart. She thought of the parcels she had delivered, of her blind loyalty to her employer. Could it be true? Had she been used as a pawn in something darker than she ever imagined? Her mind whirled with fear and doubt. But even in her confusion, one truth remained unshaken. She had never knowingly committed a crime. Yet in that room, drugged and trembling, her innocence felt like nothing more than a whisper lost in the storm. The effects of the injection lingered long after, leaving Bazaga weak and disoriented. She barely recognized her own voice as she tried to defend herself. The officer's accusations grew more pointed, painting her as an active participant in a conspiracy that sought to poison Kuwait from within. "Do you not understand?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "Drugs are eating our nation alive." 65% of crimes stem from addiction, and the factory you worked in is one of the arteries feeding this disease. Bazaga shook her head desperately. I swear, I didn't know. I only packaged medicines. I delivered parcels because my employer told me to. I never questioned it." Her words were cut off by his mocking laughter. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You expect us to believe that you lived inside a nest of vipers and never knew you were surrounded by poison? You carried those parcels with your own hands. Do not insult my intelligence." With that, he plunged a second syringe into her other arm. The searing burn returned, more violent than before, as if fire had been poured into her veins. She writhed in agony, her body drenched in sweat, her breath shallow and ragged. Every nerve screamed with unbearable pain. She collapsed against the cold chair, her cries echoing through the chamber. But her tormentor's expression remained unmoved, his eyes cold, almost inhuman. He forced her onto a block of ice, its biting chill stabbing into her skin. The contrast between the searing fire in her veins and the freezing slab beneath her body drove her to the brink of madness. Shivering violently, she tried to answer every question he hurled, but nothing satisfied him. "Where does the powder come from?" he demanded. "Who funds your boss? Which network are you working for?" She repeated the same truth over and over. She did not know. She had no names, no addresses, no secrets to betray. But her pleas for mercy were interpreted as stubbornness. The more she denied knowledge, the harsher his threats became. "As long as you remain in this prison, you will talk. We will break you, one way or another. No one leaves here with secrets untold." When he finally ordered her back to her cell, she was too weak to stand on her own. The guards dragged her across the floor like a rag doll, her body trembling uncontrollably. She realized then that her sentence of 7 years was not just a punishment of time. It was a sentence of suffering, night after night, interrogation after interrogation, until she either confessed to crimes she never committed or perished under the weight of torture. The cycle soon became a nightmare without end. Every other night, Baziga was pulled from her cell and taken to a different room. Sometimes it was the same dark chamber with the red bulb, sometimes a larger hall filled with equipment, and at other times, a bare, icy cell meant only for breaking the body and spirit. Each time, the routine was the same: questions, accusations, injections, humiliation, and torture. And each time she gave the same answer: she knew nothing. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. 6 months passed like this, leaving her body covered in scars and her spirit eroded by despair. Yet despite all the pain, she never changed her story. She did not know the source of the powders, the names of suppliers, or the shadowy networks her interrogators were desperate to expose. She had nothing to offer them, but her silence was treated as defiance, her ignorance mistaken for clever concealment. What weighed on her most was not only the cruelty of the officers, but also the betrayal of her own life. She often lay awake in her cell, remembering how she had trusted her employer without question. She thought about her husband, who had abandoned her, and her family, who had failed to stand by her. Had they supported her, she might never have been forced into this vulnerable position. Instead, she had become an easy target, swept into a system that devoured the weak. The other women in prison mirrored her despair. Their bodies bore the same marks of brutality. Their eyes were hollow, carrying secrets they would never speak aloud. Over time, Bazaga realized why no one had spoken to the filmmaker at first. Words only deepened their torment. Trusting anyone could mean further betrayal. Silence was their only shield, even if it condemned them to suffer unseen. Still, she noticed something striking. Not all of these women were guilty. Some might have committed terrible crimes, but others, like herself, had simply been caught in the tide of suspicion. And once suspicion touched a person, the truth no longer mattered. Inside these walls, innocence was irrelevant. Each night when the guards came for her, she prayed it would be the last. Sometimes she wished death would come quickly, sparing her another round of cruelty. Other times she clung to the faint hope that someone outside might discover the truth and save her. But as the months dragged on, that hope grew dimmer. In the silence of her cell, she realized she was not merely serving a sentence, she was being erased. By the time Bazaga finished recounting the months of torment, 6 long cycles of terror had already hollowed out much of her former life. Those months had not merely left bruises and scars on her skin, they had etched a new kind of fragility into her thoughts. Sleep had become a thin, restless thread between one round of interrogation and the next. Hunger and cold were predictable cruelties, but what truly exhausted her was the constant erosion of certainty. The sense that truth itself could be bent and used to punish the powerless. She no longer measured time by days or weeks, but by the intervals between the officers' visits. Each interval was a small reprieve she could only hope to stretch into survival. Despite everything, Bazaga retained a fragile core of dignity. She returned to it when the lights went down and the prison settled into tense quiet. Memories of the small routines that had steadied her before the abduction. The careful handling of parcels at the factory, the brief, awkward smiles exchanged with coworkers, the stubborn belief that doing one's job honestly was enough to weather life's storms. Those memories felt remote, but they sustained her against the rising tide of self-blame the interrogators tried to force upon her. She refused to manufacture confessions because she understood that a false admission would hand them the very control they sought. When the filmmaker, the woman who had wandered through the wards, puzzled by the silence, finally crossed the threshold into Bazaga's world, she did so with a mix of professional curiosity and human sympathy. The simple act of listening without judgment opened a fissure in the prison's enforced muteness. For the first time in months, Bazaga found herself speaking her name aloud, not as a defendant or a suspect, but as a person whose life had been abruptly derailed. Telling her story to someone who believed she deserved justice breathed a small, dangerous hope into her chest, but hope in that place carried risks. Prison gossip moved fast. A single hint that a detainee had confided in an outsider could mean harsher treatment at night. The other women watched cautiously as the filmmaker took notes and filmed small, discreet sequences. They did not ask, but their faces registered both gratitude and fear. Gratitude for being seen, fear of the consequences that visibility might trigger. Silence had protected them in the only way possible, by keeping the interrogator's attention from focusing on new details. Now that fragile protection risked crumbling, the filmmaker left with a folder of material and a promise. She would find a good lawyer and reopen the case. She would use her documentary to shine light on the abuses, and she would not allow Bazaga's voice to be swallowed by the state's machinery. Bazaga clung to the promise like a lifeline, aware that the world outside might still betray her. In the private darkness of her cell, she rehearsed the things she might say again. The facts, the names she truly knew, the simple truth of her daily life at the factory, some, not to invent complicity, but to arm any advocate with the clarity needed to defend her. Hope, fragile and dangerous, became her quiet act of resistance. When Bazaga fell silent, the weight of her words lingered in the air like smoke that refused to disperse.